You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Hello, and welcome to episode 325 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. What do we know about the American Revolution? Why is it important that we see the Revolution as a political event, a war, a time of social and economic reform, and as a time of violence and upheaval? Woody Holton, a professor of history at the University of South Carolina and an award-winning historian who specializes in the history of the American Revolution, joins us to explore and discuss answers to these very questions. Now, Woody has just published a massive book about the Revolution. It's called Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. And between this book's two covers, Woody presents the Revolution as a political event, a war, a time of social and economic reform, and as a time of violence and upheaval. In Liberty is Sweet, Woody does his best to present the Revolution and all of its events together so that we can better see the Revolution and its participants. And that's not a small task. Now, as we explore the Revolution, Woody reveals what Woody sees as the primary cause of the American Revolution, the event Woody sees as the start of the American Revolution, and details about several events of the American Revolution that we've yet to explore on this podcast. But first, now is a great time to join the Poor Richard's Book Club, a listener-created and led reading group for Ben Franklin's World listeners. Now, the club meets to discuss books about early American history, and group leaders Heather and Shari do their very best to take you beyond the written text of a book and beyond the spoken words of this podcast by bringing in guest experts who can provide you with even more details about the week's discussion topics. Now, the Poor Richard's Book Club meets on Tuesday evenings in the United States, Wednesday mornings in Australia and Asia, and it's free to join. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/book club for more details and to join the club. That's benfranklinsworld.com/book club. Are you ready for a fun and whirlwind discussion of the American Revolution? Let's go meet our expert guide. Our guest is a professor of history at the University of South Carolina. He teaches early American history and has research specialties in the American Revolution, economic history, and in the histories of African Americans, Native Americans, and women. He's an award-winning scholar who's written several books, including his most recent book, Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Woody Holton.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Well, I'm glad we can make it happen, Woody. It's been 175 episodes since we last spoke, and I just had so much fun the last time. I'm really glad we could get you back on the show. Now, you've just written this big book about the American Revolution called Liberty is Sweet, and we're going to talk a lot about that book today, so I think we should just dive right on in. I'd really like to start by talking about the work of writing a big book about the American Revolution. You know, over the last several years, it's really seemed to be in vogue that every well-known scholar of the Revolution has decided to write a comprehensive and sweeping history of the Revolution from what they see as the start of the event to the end of the event. And surprisingly, all of these studies have been a bit different from each other. So Woody, what inspired you to undertake this huge task of writing about the American Revolution as a complete event? What made you want to write Liberty is Sweet?
What inspired me to do it was that I thought it would be easier than it was. Because I've been able to finagle out of my bosses the real specialization that I almost never teach the 17th or 19th century, or even the first half of the 18th. I've really managed to hang out at the Revolution in my teaching, and I've had great students right from the start who've had great comments, and I've jotted down a lot of their comments and refined the lectures. And I think, all I have to do is write up my lectures and these great comments I've picked up from students over the years. And I did do all of that. And that was a tiny, tiny portion of what I needed. I knew that the military history was my weak spot. Like a lot of people who teach the Revolution, I spent years disappointing my students by spending a week on the battles which is what they signed up for. And the rest on the social history and the politics and the ideological origin, all that stuff that we care about, and only a week on what they wanted. This book was published by Simon & Schuster, and I knew they were going to want military history. And I'll tell you, no one's asked me this before, Liz, so I'll tell you first that my model was not Middlecoff's wonderful book about the Revolution or Gary Nash's or Alan Taylor's. Those are all good. My model was McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, because I thought he talked about the battles in a way that wasn't boring, and also a tremendous amount on the origins of the revolution. So my highest aspiration, no one's done it but me yet, but my highest aspiration was that somebody would compare Liberty is Sweet to Battle Cry of Freedom. But that meant I really had to go to school on the military history. And as I say, I started off doing the military history because you gotta for this audience. But I wasn't shooting that much at academics so much as ordinary readers that want military history along with the rest. And so I had to do it, but I ended up loving it. And it ended up being my favorite part of it, actually, was the military conflict.
Well, that's the thing about the American Revolution, right? Is that it is an event that includes both a war and a political event, and also an economic event and a social event. It is just a truly multifaceted time period of early American history. And I mean, this is why I study it. You can never get bored. It is just so complicated. There is so much to know about it. And this is where I started thinking, by the way, that the more books that scholars research and write about the revolution, the more we know about this event, which makes the task that you had to write Liberty is Sweet even tougher, because you had all of this new scholarship to consume so that you could tell us such a comprehensive history, and especially about all the different peoples who participated in this event.
Well, and they kept cranking this stuff out even as I was trying to finish. I mean, I think T. Cole Jones's book came out very near the end of my process and really forced me to change a lot. He's also the one who caught me referring to the Royal Army. There was no Royal Army. The Navy was considered royal, but the Army wasn't. So yes, it's an immense amount. And at some point, there's a lot of great scholarship that appeared in the last 2 or 3 years before it came out that is just not in there because I had to put on blinders at some point. But actually, you talk about the range of different fields that go into the American Revolution. That's my more noble motive for writing this, other than, I had all these lecture notes. It was that as much as I love all those books I mentioned that have been written about the revolution, what no one had done was a straight narrative that integrates everybody. That is the military history, but also all the people you mentioned introducing me to, the people that I've been more interested in, the people that are not on the back of the $2 bill. There's a chapter on them in almost every book that comes out these days. In the back, there's a chapter on women and a chapter on blacks and a chapter on Indians. And then I think the person who's come closest is Alan Taylor, and I really love his book, American Revolutions. But even there, I think Alan would say, I would focus on African Americans and then focus on the war for a while, then come back to Native Americans or whatever. And I mean, I got to do that too. So it may be impossible to do a straight narrative, but that at least was the goal, was to get everybody into the same narrative, because of course that's how it actually happened.
I'm glad you brought that up, your attempt to write a more inclusive narrative of the revolution, because this really leads us into the kerfuffle that took place over the summer and fall of 2021. Now, it has been said by many scholars of the neo-Whig school of historical thought, and these are the scholars who tend to see ideas and ideology about governance as being the primary cause of the American Revolution. And it was said by many neo-Whig scholars that your primary goal in Liberty is Sweet is really to claim that slavery was the primary cause of the revolution. And Woody, I was really intrigued by this, and I was looking forward to reading Liberty is Sweet with seeing how you were going to make this case. And I kept my eyes peeled. Like I said, I was looking for this argument, but I didn't find it. I walked away from your book thinking that what you were really trying to do was to offer us a more inclusive history of the revolution by highlighting the events that we all know about, the tried and true events, while also including women, Native Americans, Africans and African Americans, and all their really important contributions to the revolution. So could you speak to us about whether you think slavery was the primary cause of the revolution and about your views on what was said and debated last summer?
Well, to answer your question first, I think it was a primary cause in the South, but not the. But to talk about that historiography a little bit, you're not the first person to say to me, I'm so glad you said it, because other people have said to me in emails, open up your book to see you making this case that it was all about African-American influence and nobody else mattered. And I can't find that. Are they critiquing a different book from the one you wrote? The way you asked it, Liz, reminds me of this study that sociologists did where they flash a picture on the old slide projector of a bunch of people at a bus stop. Some are black and some are white. You only see the picture for like a half a second. And they ask white audiences, what percentage of the people waiting for that bus were black? And white audiences, people who look like you and me, inevitably say, oh, about 2/3 of them were black. And then you look at the slide again and 1 out of 20 people waiting for that bus was African American. And I think that's kind of what happened with some of the reaction to my inclusion of African Americans is if you include them at all, for some people who are used to not including them at all, it seems like that's the only thing you're talking about. And it made me sad because Gordon Wood is a good friend of mine who I really like and admire his work, as so many others do, took it as though I was trying to tear down the founding fathers. And I don't think I did that either. I thought I was providing a balanced view of them. I do think the principles are a lot more to be revered than the people. But by the people, I don't just mean the founding fathers. I mean Liz Covart and Woody Holton, anybody who's human, who has flaws. We have flaws. The notion that all men and women are created equal, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton revised it in 1848, that notion does not have flaws. That's perfect. So let's start with that principle, but now let's go to the details of that question of the African-American role in indirectly and unintentionally provoking many whites to be more interested in declaring independence. I think if you poll the people from Simon Schama, who wrote Rough Crossings, I'm sorry to say that Benjamin Quarles is no longer with us, who really started all this in 1961 with the Negro and the American Revolution, and Cass Pybus over at the University of Sydney, originally from Tasmania. Pretty wide range of scholars. Gerald Horne, who I've been reading a lot lately. Everybody who's really looked at the evidence agrees that white Americans were furious at the British for this. And I'm going to use the word that's been so controversial on Twitter and elsewhere, but it was an informal alliance. African Americans initiated with the British, and then the British in some places eagerly accepted it, not because they were anti-slavery, but because they were desperate. And so you get this alliance between the British and the blacks in some places. It infuriates whites wherever it happens. And there's hardly anybody you can name among white revolutionaries who weren't furious about that. Tom Paine hated slavery, but he also hated this alliance between the British and the blacks. So I went on Twitter eventually, and you can search for this hashtag, countdown to 1619, and I put up 76 quotes from Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Paine, Franklin, again, about anybody you can name, quotes from them saying how bad they were at the British for making this alliance with African Americans. And in many cases, also the back half of that, which is, and so therefore we have one more reason to declare independence.
If white Americans were so upset and mad about an informal alliance between the British Army and African Americans, how did they respond to the fact that there were all these formal alliances between Native Americans and the British Army?
Even worse. And actually, the parallels there are remarkable in that, of course, we're talking about two people of color who formed alliances with the British. As you point out, with natives, it became a formal alliance. In both cases, it was really the people of color, African Americans and later Native Americans, who initiated that alliance. The British kind of made threats and talked about it and were encouraged by the diehards back in England to make this alliance, but weren't really doing it. And Native Americans, like African Americans, really pushed it. So, for instance, I'm talking to you from Columbia, South Carolina, and not far from me was the so-called Cherokee War of 1776. That was started first by the usual atrocities by whites on the frontier against the Cherokees. But then when the Cherokees struck back, they told the British, okay, we're ready to join you and we'll attack the colonists. And the British told the Cherokees, do not attack white colonists. We're afraid that'll just make them mad. We'll tell you when it's time. To which the Cherokees said to their then informal allies, screw you, we'll attack when we want to. And they attacked. it's off topic, but I can't resist saying that one of the early battles of that Cherokee War, when the whites went to go burn Cherokee fields, one of the first battles was where Clemson University is here in South Carolina now. And the first South Carolinian, the white guy, to die in that battle happened to be Jewish, which just to me shows the amazing complexity of when we talk about natives versus colonists. There's a lot more behind that.
Well, now that we've covered some of the ideas and motivations that caused you to write Liberty is Sweet, we should turn our attention now to another controversial issue of the American Revolution, which is when you think the American Revolution began. As you know, Woody, scholars seem to differ by degrees and for many different reasons as to the actual starting point of the revolution. And this was a topic we covered in quite depth in episode 151. But I wonder if you would tell us when you chose to start the revolution in Liberty is Sweet and why you believe in the accuracy of your starting point.
When you're writing for Simon & Schuster as opposed to the University Press of X, everybody wants to try to be as novelesque as you can. So I tried to do things like suspense and develop characters and all that. But part of being novelesque is having a sort of recurring themes. And I was just stunned as I was doing the research on 1765 and 75 and 85 and 95, how much people talked about 1755, that the Battle of the Monongahela, where Braddock leads British troops out to try to capture what's now Pittsburgh from the French, but was thwarted and killed himself. His army suffered 2/3 casualties, 8 miles short of Pittsburgh, Fort Duquesne, the French called it, by a party that had some French people. The French commander was killed in the first volley, but mostly Native Americans. And so my point is that it was sort of the way the Great War, World War I, affected the next 3 generations until World War II. It was the thing that people kept coming back to, the traumatic experience. Everybody keeps referring to the Monongahela. For instance, when Washington walks in or rides into Boston on March 18th, 1776, after the British have left, he goes, man, they left behind a lot of supplies, just as many as we left behind after Braddock's expedition. It's the touchstone for so much that happened in the Revolution. So I thought it was great to have that as a recurring theme, as this thing they kept coming back to that I could keep coming back to as a touchstone. But then also, more meaningfully in terms of the causation of the revolution, I'd written an essay before arguing that the 7 Years' War, the Americans call the French and Indian War, actually made the American Revolution less likely. Wrote that about 20 years ago and have spent the whole time since then saying how wrong I was, because I now think that both the 7 Years' War and the way it ended really made the Revolutionary War almost, to use that dirty word, inevitable. We like to say nothing's inevitable. Everything's contingent. No, of course it is. But there's a lot of ways in which the 7 Years' War led to the American Revolution. And the one that I'll say most significantly is that it told Parliament, you need to change everything about your relationship with your American colonies. And so I wanted to call the first section of my book Parliament's Rebellion, because it really was not Washington and Jefferson who rebelled against Britain. It was Parliament that rebelled against the status quo of 1762, because it was the British who came out of that war furious at the colonists for smuggling enemy molasses through. That is trading with the enemy. It would be like me selling my books to Al Qaeda. Well, now, but even though the day after 9/11, Holton announces he sold 30 books to Al Qaeda. That's what they were doing, but they weren't announcing it. And so the British were mad about that. The British were mad about the colonists swiping Native American land. And again, not because the British were humanitarians and interested in Native people like anthropology, none of that. The most expensive thing that governments do is go to war. They'd nearly doubled their debt paying for the 7 Years' War. And so they were mad at the colonists for provoking this war. So they not only drew the proclamation line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains saying colonists don't go west of there, don't provoke Indians, but they also left 10,000 troops in America, mostly to guard the colonists against the Indians, but also to guard the Indians against the colonists to try to avoid another war. And I have to give you my line here. The British said, all right, we're going to build a human wall on the western border, and we're going to make the colonists pay for it. And that was the Stamp Act. So no Native Americans, no Stamp Act. But These are all ways in which the British thought they learned a lesson from the French and Indian War, and that is the colonists have gotten out of hand. We got to get them under control. Of course, the Spanish and French were learning the same lesson. They learned by losing, and therefore we get the so-called Bourbon reforms where they cracked down on their colonies in America. But Brendan McConville really put this well for me one time. And I said, why would the British feel like they've got to reform? They don't need Bourbon reforms. They are the winners. He goes, yeah, they needed reform because they won, because they've got something worth fighting for now.
So from everything you just said, I think we can safely infer that you see economics as a primary cause of the American Revolution. You were talking about taxation and paying for armies and war and increased war debt. So it sounds like your view is that a lot of the reasons why the American Revolution erupted was really due to money and economics.
I do. That's not to discount ideology. One of my favorite Gordon Wood essays is called Rhetoric and Reality. And he described ideology as like a foggy window or a smoky window that distorts what you see. And we all act not on reality, but on what we think is going on. And so I completely buy that. And I think it's of most interest to historians of slavery because you could certainly see how the touchiness of the founding fathers that so many historians have written so effectively about, that their touchiness would come from seeing what real slavery looks like. A guy named Nwabweze Okoye wrote an article for the Williamsburg Quarterly in the 70s called Chattel Slavery is the Nightmare of the American Revolutionaries. And he pointed out, to start off, what everybody notices is that they're constantly saying, the British are trying to enslave us. But others had said, well, they just meant slavery in some political sense, not as in African slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean. But then what Okoye did was find all these quotes from people like Washington saying, the British want to put chains on us just like we put chains on our blacks and make us work their tobacco fields just like we make blacks work our tobacco fields. So I do think ideology was important, and studying ideology is not separate from studying the conflict between the enslavers and the 20% of Americans who were enslaved. And so that's part of my getting it all into one narrative. Okay, let's do ideology and let's do Black history at the same time, because you can't do either successfully without.
I think we can see that in Liberty is Sweet, Woody is offering us a fairly comprehensive view of the American Revolution. Liberty is Sweet really weaves in the stories of economic and political unrest with the politics of navigating the world as a new nation under the Continental and Confederation Congresses. And all of these stories are, of course, interwoven with the trials and tribulations of trying to wage an 8-year-long war for independence. Now, Woody, you cover so many different aspects of the American Revolution that I'd like to ask you some questions about lesser-known events and battles that we've never actually talked about on this podcast before. So here's another way that you can be new and novel by helping to introduce us to aspects of the revolution that many of us may not have considered before. I wonder if we could talk about the non-importation, non-exportation movements of the 1760s and 1770s. But first, let's take a quick moment to talk about our episode sponsors. For listeners who served or worked with the United States Marine Corps, or who may have friends and family who might have, I'd like to notify you about an available resource. From 1953 to 1987, personnel who were assigned to Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune were potentially exposed to contaminated drinking water. Now, the Marine Corps has since partnered with health agencies to conduct scientific studies to assess impacts from these potential exposures. And they're working to keep those Marines, their families, and civilian employees informed with updates and resources available to them. If you or someone you know may have been at Camp Lejeune between 1953 and 1987, please consider registering with the Camp Lejeune Historic Drinking Water Notification Database. You can register and learn more at marines.mil/CL water. That's marines.mil/CL water. How did Black people sustain their vision for freedom through the rise of Jim Crow? In the second season of Seizing Freedom, Dr. Kidada E. Williams will join a host of artists, intellectuals, and activists to explore answers to this question. The first African-American generation after emancipation really had to grapple with the lessons passed down to them after Reconstruction. Should they turn inward and form their own institutions? Or should they continue to push for their constitutionally enshrined equality? Should they continue to remain living in the South? Or should they move to the North or West? Seizing Freedom's 8 narrative episodes in Season 2 will show how individuals and groups wrestled with these questions, and how they laid the foundation for the burgeoning civil rights movement. And complementary interview episodes discuss how the legacy of this time period in United States history still impacts the nation today. Seizing Freedom is a co-production of Virginia Public Media and Molten Heart. You can listen to Season 2 of Seizing Freedom wherever you get your podcasts. Woody, would you tell us about the non-importation, non-exportation movements of the 1760s and 1770s, how these movements were organized, and who participated in them?
Yes, I'm really glad you asked about them, because before the shooting got started, this was the main weapon. We've all heard of tarring and feathering, and of course, the throwing of 342 chests into Boston Harbor was pretty significant when that happened on the night of December 6, 1773. But the main weapon before the shooting was one that we are talking about doing if Russia invades Ukraine and constantly dealing with, and that is an economic boycott. And the reaction of the Stamp Act was sort of an automatic cessation of imports, and that really was part of the reason that the Stamp Act was repealed. But it was done much more deliberatively and consciously after the Parliament adopted the Townshend duties, especially that famous tax on tea, and then really with a vengeance in 1774 when Parliament adopted the coercive acts closing the port of Boston, revoking the charter of Massachusetts, and all these other things. So I think the boycotts are fascinating in themselves, and they're also fascinating because they are another integrator in the same way that ideology is, because you can't successfully write about them without writing about African Americans and women in particular. And one of the things that intrigued me writing this book was the conflicts between men and women that the boycotts brought up. So, for instance, there's 2 main ways women can help and have to help or the boycotts won't succeed. A, joining men in not consuming. And the prejudice, at least, I've never been able to work this out whether it's true, but the prejudice, at least, was that women drank even more tea than men. So you can't boycott tea unless women boycott tea. So that's one way women are crucial. The other way women are crucial is when the colonists start boycotting British textiles. You need women to at least symbolically replace those textiles by running the spinning wheels and weaving that thread into cloth. I sometimes exaggerate this, and I'll try not to now, but if you lived anywhere near navigable water in 1776, it was cheaper to import British cloth than it was to make it. And so there weren't that many spinning wheels in the port cities, but people started building them. John Parker, the guy who led the troops at Lexington on April 19, 1775, somebody showed me evidence that he had an explosion in orders for spinning wheels because he was a wheelwright. You know, he's like makes wagon wheels and spinning wheels. The explosion of orders in the 1760s as women were sort of relearning how to spin. And that's one of the conflicts because spinning by that time was seen as something frontier women do because they're so far from navigable water. Poor women do. Spinsters do, you know, that's thus the name. You know, you've never found a husband, so you're stuck living with your sister and her family, and you earn part of your keep running a spinning wheel. But my point is, if you're like a middle class, respectable woman, spinning's a little bit beneath you. And I think that's the real reason they had these spinning bees, because it's less embarrassing if you do it as a group. You're overcoming the sort of humiliation. On the other hand, in the South, there were no spinning bees because by the 1760s, spinning was so closely associated with enslaved women that white women just couldn't bring themselves to spin. And you can't find any evidence of spinning bees down there. Washington was one that was trying to get the women he claimed to own working both the looms and spinning wheels. And there was resistance. Back when Mrs. Washington, then Mrs. Custis, owned us, she told us we didn't have to weave, and he got into some major conflicts with the people he enslaved. So you've got conflicts between enslaved women and their enslavers. Well, a couple more of the conflicts. Philadelphia, the merchants didn't want to go along with the 1768 boycott because they go, you know, this is what we do for a living. If no one buys anything, then we're going out of business. It's sort of like people now saying, if you shut down my business because of COVID. So they resisted, and the New York merchants and Boston merchants said, well, if Philadelphia isn't going to boycott, neither are we, until Hannah Griffiths, who was a Quaker woman living in Philadelphia and had been circulating a lot of her poetry. She wrote a poem that's been quoted a lot because it uses the phrase Daughters of Liberty. But the key line in that poem is, if the sons of liberty so degenerate something, then let the daughters of liberty arise. That is, she's saying the male merchants of Philadelphia have ruined non-importation for the whole colonies. And so we women need to rise up and be the ones to do it. And not that poem alone, but that whole sentiment among Philadelphia women pushed men in Philadelphia into doing it. And that got it going in almost all of the rebelling colonies. On the other hand, in Boston, men are signing statements saying, we're going to not import any tea. And then a week later, the women of Boston sign a paper saying, we're not going to import any tea except for medicine. And the fact they did that a week after the men, when you put it all in the same timeline, you see that the women are clearly responding to the men because they saw it as medicinal.
It's funny when you think about the resistance and women reacting as they did in Boston and Philadelphia, because you can see in this instance how the American Revolution is also a bit of a proto-feminist movement, right? Here we have women pushing back against men saying, well, you don't quite have this non-importation, non-exportation thing, right? So we're going to push these movements forward, and we're going to do it in a way that makes sense to us. Like, we'll stop importing tea except for medicinal purposes, and we'll also make sure that we see about getting spinning and cloth making up and running so we don't have to import as much British cloth.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's coming from a couple of things. And really, I found a few new little tidbits like the ones I've just mentioned, but most of us is just playing out what Mary Beth Norton had already worked out in 1980 in Liberty's Daughters, that the revolution is impacting women both as a revolution, but maybe even more as a war. You might remember her saying that she was just looking at pronouns, something people are interested in a lot today, that a lot of these women would write letters to their husbands during the war. The husband's off as a colonel of some regiment in the war. Mom's back home running the farm. And she'll, in the first couple of years of the war, talk about, oh, your farm is not doing that well because there was a drought. And then the next year said, our farm is actually doing okay. And then the following year, oh, my farm is really not doing well because it was a terrible drought. The pronouns are just showing the growing empowerment of these women. And of course, I came along many, many decades after that and said, oh, one woman in particular took that to an extreme. Abigail Adams was not a great farmer, but she was a great financial manager. And she managed to parlay her financial acumen into really contributing to making that a wealthy family, none of which would have happened if John had remained in Massachusetts.
And you can hear more about Abigail Adams and her financial prowess in our earlier conversation with Woody in episode 150. Okay, from non-importation and non-exportation, I'd like for us to talk about something completely different, which is the Carolina Regulator Movement. Woody, we've yet to talk about the Regulator Movement on this podcast, and since you cover this movement so well in your book, Liberty is Sweet, I wonder if you would tell us about the North Carolina Regulator Movement, which took place between 1766 and 1771.
The most interesting thing for me as a South Carolinian who went to school in North Carolina is how different the North Carolina regulators were from the South Carolina regulators. Almost opposites. I think a better modern term for the South Carolina regulators would be vigilantes. Now, some of the people serving in the South Carolina regulator bands were enslaved people who, some maybe coming along with their owner or enslaver, or others just falling in with these regulator bands. But although you had them, in general, the South Carolina regulators were the establishment trying to crack down on the biggest thing they were attacking was horse thieves. And the real penman of the South Carolina regulation is the Anglican minister, Charles Woodmason, who's your classic, get off my lawn, fuddy-duddy guy, or these rancid, dirty masses. I mean, an absolute grotesque elitist. And that's kind of what the South Carolina regulators were. Although, again, they were enslaved because this colony was half enslaved. There were enslaved people on both sides of the South Carolina regulators. The North Carolina regulators, to me, are much more interesting because they really were, as Marlene Carr shows in Breaking Loose Together, really were pursuing social justice, and they'd been influenced by Quakerism. Their penman was the man named Herman Husband, who wrote a bunch of essays in 1760s and early 1770s supporting those regulators, and then would disappear with a price on his head. It took the pen name Tuskegee Death and reappeared in Pennsylvania and ended up being one of the penmen of the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 and 5, and finally died as a result of the Whiskey Rebellion. They didn't kill him, but they put him in jail so long that he died of flu or whatever. And so the North Carolina rebels, influenced by Quaker faith and by evangelical religion, which a lot of people today associate evangelicalism with conservatism, but was more often associated then with social radicalism. So, for instance, women often played leadership roles, chairing committees and things like that in Baptist churches and to lesser extent Methodist churches. You have all these physical things that kind of scared the elite. Washing of feet, including the master washing his slaves' feet. Like Mary Magdalene tried to wash Jesus' feet. She said, no, let me wash her. And the kiss of peace. Imagine that, a kiss of peace between black and white. But, those churches, a lot of them, most of them early on were racially integrated, not non-hierarchical. And some historians have persuaded us that the first generation probably went too far in saying how gender and class and race challenging they were, but they were challenging them a little bit. So anyway, the North Carolina regulators were influenced by all of that and were battling a lot of the things that the colonists would rebel against, like taxes. And Governor Tryon, the royal governor of North Carolina in 1771, led an army out to the backcountry and fought a battle. I want to say July of 1781 at the Alamance Creek, but it was not a foretelling of the American Revolution in that it's not like it was loyalists on one side and future patriots on the other side, because there were lots of patriots, elite patriots on Governor Tryon's side, because they were the lawyers and the land speculators against whom the farmers were rebelling.
So when we look at the North Carolina Regulator Movement, how should we place it within our general framework of the lead up to the American War for Independence?
Oh, I think it all comes back to what Carl Becker said in 1909. This was a struggle for home rule, and we don't want to downplay that. Half my book is the battles of the Revolution against the British. Although even in that part of it, there's internal conflicts going on as well. Mutinies by the Continental Army, desertions, and so forth and so on. But to quote Becker, it was a struggle for home rule, as we all learned from our elementary school textbooks, but it was also a struggle over who should rule at home or who would rule at home. And the only thing that we can revise, he said that back in 1909, the only thing we would revise is not a struggle over who should rule at home, but many, many struggles, and some of which we've been talking about.
Now, the Gatsby Affair of 1772. This is an event that is well known in Rhode Island, but once you leave the Ocean State, knowledge about this event actually turns out to be pretty limited. Woody, would you tell us about the Gatsby Affair in June 1772?
Yeah, I had to kind of fight my editor for my version of the Gatsby Affair because it's so jarring the way I went about it. And I admit it's jarring, but I wanted to jar people because the way I described it was there is a Coast Guard cutter stationed off of Providence, Rhode Island, and a bunch of people from Providence get in, their motorboats and motor out to this Coast Guard cutter and take it over and burn it. Out of all the shocking things we've seen in the last 4 years or so, that would be pretty darn shocking if Americans attacked one of our own Navy ships. And so I can see you through the computer looking quizzical. What are you talking about? That's the point. That's exactly what they did. These were British subjects who in 1772 found out that a British Coast Guard cutter that is in charge of cracking down on smugglers had run aground. And, rather than do what you would expect somebody to do, this is your Navy, go out and help them wait for high tide and help them tow it off or get it off the sandbar. They went out and they shot the captain in the groin. Didn't kill anybody, fortunately, I think, for them because of consequences, but got the crew off and then burned the ship to the hull. And I think it's a reminder of how much, from Pennsylvania on up, how much the battle over molasses smuggling was central to the American Revolution, because that's what that ship was doing, was catching people smuggling in Spanish molasses from Cuba. Of course, it's all slave-grown molasses. French-grown molasses from places like Guadeloupe, Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti, and so forth. But to finish that story of Gatsby, that was in 1772, and the British started saying, okay, they burned up their own country's Navy ship to the water level, and nobody was punished. And so the British started talking about bringing people to England for trial. And then Parliament made that official the following year. That really fed into the coercive acts, which really got the revolution to a whole new radical stage. But since you mentioned the Gatsby Affair, I also got to mention, and you were noticing, I think you're correct. I'm not telling the whole story. I'm doing my best, but I do focus on economics. I want to talk about the economic origins of the Boston Massacre, because why were those troops quartered in Boston? They were quartered in people's houses. That never happened. The quartering acts didn't do that. But they were there, right there in the town. And why were they in the town? Because British officials in the town had asked for them. And why they asked for them? Because British officials in Boston found themselves completely unable to enforce the parliamentary ban on smuggling in foreign molasses and bringing wine directly from the wine islands like the Azores and Madeira. So start at the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770, and go backwards. Okay, it's happening because the troops are there. Why are the troops there? The troops are there to support the customs service and cracking down on smuggling. And why did we need troops? Because they couldn't do it alone because people were so determined to smuggle in those goods. And so I think there's really an economic origin of the Boston Massacre, not to mention the fact that the whole thing took place in front of the customs house. And that's what the British thought the crowd was trying to do. And maybe some in the crowd were trying to get in that custom house and get to the king's gold.
Speaking of economics, you mentioned at the start of our conversation that one of your goals in Liberty is Sweet is to bring people new and novel information about the revolution. And one aspect of Liberty is Sweet that I did find that was new and novel, or perhaps old and newly novel, is your discussion of the Navigation Acts as a cause for the revolution. Would you remind us about what these economic acts were, what the Navigation Acts were, and how and why you see them as fomenting and taking a pretty big role in, fomenting the revolution in British North America?
Well, in the North, it's especially clear. The biggest manifestation of the Navigation Acts in the North is the policy going back to the 17th century of Parliament that, you were supposed to trade within the empire. And specifically, actually, in 1733, Parliament, it said, okay, you're importing molasses into Pennsylvania, especially Rhode Island and New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and turning it into rum. Anytime you can take a sweetener and turn it into something that makes people drunk and gets them addicted, that's a good business to be in. And that was a very profitable business. But Parliament said way back in 1733, you're welcome to do that, but we want you to buy molasses from Jamaica and Barbados and other British colonies grown by British enslaved people, not French and Spanish. And the colonists said, we can't get enough from those places. It's a little bit like the battle today over the employers saying, we can't just hire people who are here legally. There's not enough of them, or there are not enough Americans who want to do these dirty jobs. We got to bring in people overseas in the current case. And molasses from the enemy, because they kept, as I was saying at the start, they were still importing French and Spanish molasses right when French and Spanish people were killing British people in the French and Indian War. So the British had said not to do it since 1733. They did it with a prohibitive tax. And instead of paying the tax, they would bribe the customs collectors. They'd pay a little bit of the tax, like a fraction of what they actually owed. So that's, I think, a major grievance in the North. They finally, in 1776, Parliament, at the same time it repealed the Stamp Act, it cut the molasses duty down to 1 penny on everything. So that one did somewhat get resolved, but it led to a lot of conflict. They were still trying to get around it. That's why the Gaspé got in trouble 10 years after that. So that's the big thing in the North. I would say in the South, I like to think of the Navigation Acts as the big asterisk to what I said to you at the beginning, which was really Parliament that was dissatisfied with the imperial setup of 1762. And I think in general, that's true. If you look at somebody like Jefferson or Washington, or here in Virginia, Henry Lawrence and the Rutledges and so forth, here in South Carolina, generally they were pretty happy in 1762. They loved their king. The one thing they didn't love was having to send, especially in the Chesapeake, all of their tobacco to Britain. only about 20% of it was consumed there. So most of it basically came off of one ship, went into a warehouse, and then went on another ship, and then went on to its actual destination, which would be France or the Netherlands and Germany and so forth. And that was very profitable for the tobacco merchants who are moving it around off and on this ship. It was profitable for dock workers who would take a handful of that tobacco as it went by, a very expensive commodity. But anyway, it was great for them, but terrible for the Chesapeake enslavers whose slaves were growing that tobacco. But they were willing to tolerate that so long as you don't have to do anything else. But when the British came and said, we're going to levy stamp tax on you and a tea tax on you and all these other things in addition, that's when the colonists said, in essence, the old expression about the straw that breaks the camel's back, we are already groaning under the burden of the Navigation Acts. And we're happy to do that. Or we'd be happy to pay your taxes, but not both. You decide. They wouldn't technically pay taxes. They'd pay a contribution every year in a quota system. They were serious about the principle. Here's where I do believe in the ideology. They were serious about the principle of no taxation without representation, but they could have worked it out by taxing themselves and sending a bunch of money over to Parliament. Jefferson said as late as 1775, that would be great. We'd love to pay money to Parliament as long as we can do it in a constitutional way. But here's the important but, only if you repeal the Navigation Acts. And in fact, he said that would be better. So here's my point. The textbooks, they often mention the Navigation Acts back when they were adapted in the 1600s, but they're not part of the story of the Revolution. But here's why I think they should be, because Jefferson made it clear that he found the Navigation Acts to be a bigger burden than having to contribute to the upkeep of the British Empire. He would rather contribute and get free of Navigation Acts. So one of the lines in Declaration of Independence, right along the reference to the merciless Indian savages and the domestic insurrections, which is slaves, one of the lines in the Declaration of Independence is about Parliament impairing our free trade with all the world. They wanted free trade with all the world, and they hadn't had it. In New England, they'd had it until 1763 because that 1733 law wasn't really enforced until 1763 when Parliament cracked down. In the Chesapeake colonies, that monopoly, there was a little bit of smuggling, but nothing like in the molasses area. That had been a pretty airtight ban on trading with the enemy in tobacco. They hated it. They were willing to tolerate it so long as they didn't have to pay taxes as well.
Now, Woody covers the politics of the Revolution in great detail in his book, Liberty is Sweet. But we're actually going to jump over the political happenings of the Revolution so that we can discuss the other strength of Woody's book, which is the military history of the Revolution. Now, many comprehensive histories of the American Revolution tend to divide the War for Independence into two phases. A northern phase that scholars date usually between the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775 and 1778, just after the French entered the War for Independence. And then they see a southern phase, which begins in 1778 and ends with the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. I never really thought about this division in the war, this division into two phases, until I read Liberty is Sweet. And now I wonder if you could tell us why historians do this. Because if you look at the war as a whole and you consider everybody's strategies, this seemingly artificial division that historians create to tell the story of the Revolution really seems to be at odds with at least the British strategy in waging this war.
It certainly is at odds with British strategy. I totally agree. The British, for instance, tried to attack Charleston, South Carolina in 1776. And they were back as early as 1778. They captured Savannah, Georgia, and then tried Charleston in 1779 and finally got it in 1780. So for them, it would be weird to talk about a Southern versus Northern phase because they were always interested in the South. I think the reason historians, it's just simpler because it's so hard to talk about two theaters at once. You end up skipping around, as I do in my book, the only way I could do it. But I think the reason historians like to talk about two phases is they're following the Continental Army. And this is I think a long-standing prejudice. Interestingly, it's not always been the prejudice. The historians used to think, the militia won the war. We don't care about these Continental Army guys because they didn't like standing armies. And they wanted to think the militia won the war single-handedly. That's certainly not true. But it's also not true that the Continental Army won the war single-handedly. And so, for instance, I think the turning point battle of the Revolutionary War I think we all agree that it took place in the South, but many people will say it was Daniel Morgan's victory at Cowpens, January 17th, 1781. But really, I think it was the Americans' victory at Kings Mountain, not far from there, on October 7th, 1780. That is 3 months earlier. And what's important is there were no Continental officers at Cowpens. That was all militia. And so I think part of that prejudice in favor of the northern phase and the southern phase is a prejudice in favor of the Continental Army. But it's clear the militia were crucially engaged throughout the war. You know, you could argue that the first person to die as a result of the Revolutionary War, of course, we've got Crispus Attucks and Christopher Snyder back in 1770. But if you talk about the war, the first person to die was a man named George, who was executed in South Carolina early in 1775 for trying to organize blacks to support the British when they would arrive. And of course, Thomas Jeremiah was a free black pilot who was executed here in South Carolina that following summer. So that's being done by the militia and the slave patrol. And the militia were also fighting loyalists in 1775 here in South Carolina and fighting Native Americans, as I said. So yeah, the war happened in the South. It happened every single year right up till 1782, when I like to point out that the last battle of the Revolutionary War in which Continental soldiers died took place near Charleston. And it was a black man who tricked them, saying, hey, I'm sympathetic to your side, and there's basically a cache of British materials you can easily grab here. And they ran to get those materials and ran right into a trap, and a couple of them were killed. The last Continental soldiers to die in the war. A black man named Joseph Harris started the first Southern battle of the war, the Battle of Hampton, October 27, 1775 in Virginia. And so African Americans were part of that. So yeah, that anti-Southern prejudice becomes an anti-black prejudice too, frankly, because African Americans were only about 5% of the population in most of the northern states, but we're 40% of the population down here.
Let's linger on the Battle of Kings Mountain for a bit more, because you mentioned that just like the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, and of course, we've heard historians on this podcast refute the idea that Saratoga was the turning point of the War for Independence, which is normally how it's written about. But you see Kings Mountain and the Battle of Kings Mountain as being a big turning point in the war. And you know, Woody, maybe this is just my northern upbringing and prejudice, you know, born and bred in New England, and I wrote my dissertation on early New York. But it wasn't until I read Liberty is Sweet that I'd ever heard of Kings Mountain as being a sort of turning point in the war. So would you tell us more about the Battle of Kings Mountain and how you view it as being a turning point in the American fight for independence?
Okay, well, first on the battle itself, what's interesting about it for me was that, A, there was no general there. And not on the British side as well. In fact, the only British officer there was their commander, who I think was a lieutenant colonel. And so it's really loyalists versus patriot militia in that battle. So that's one interesting thing about it. And then the even more exciting thing to me about Kings Mountain was that the crucial element in the American strategy that caused them to win that battle so decisively was retreat. That is, they programmed retreat into their strategy because some large number, certainly more than half of their men, were carrying rifles. And it's so hard when you talk to somebody who hasn't talked much about revolutionary firelocks. They go, why would anybody be dumb enough to carry a musket when they can have a rifle? Because muskets are only effective at most at 100 yards, and a good rifleman with putting his barrel in a fence can shoot at 300 yards accurately. And all these great things about rifles. Well, rifles are great in all those ways, but they take 3 times as long to reload, and they don't carry muskets. So Gates made, and I think an understandable mistake. At Camden, he made the mistake of leading with his militia. A lot of them had rifles, and they ran into the crack troops on the British side who had muskets with those bayonets, who just ran right through them. And, you know, a lot of them didn't stop running until they were in Charlotte, North Carolina, including Gates. But having seen that failure in August of 1780, the colonels who were running things on the American side at Kings Mountain in October of 1780 said, here's what we're going to do. We've got Ferguson, who was the British commander. We've got him trapped on this mountain. but we don't have that many people. So we'll surround them, but we're not just going to go running up the mountain because our guys will get their one shot with their rifles and then have nothing else against British bayonets. And so what each of these regiments was told to do is go to the top of the mountain, get as close as you can, fire a shot, and then they're going to come after you. After you fire your volley, the British are going to come after you. Feel free to run away. Go back down the mountain to where nobody's shooting at you, and so you can reload, and then we'll regroup and come back. And I thought it was a brilliant strategy, but who would have thought, talk about thinking outside the box, who would have thought that retreat would work? One thing is that officers in the British as well as the American Army are programmed not to think that way, because they're programmed to think if you let your men go backwards, they'll keep going backwards forever. And that does sometimes happen. One guy steps back one step and everybody else thinks it's retreat. I think that's what happened at Monmouth, partly because of the heat. People went back for shade and everyone else says, okay, we're retreating. Let's get out of here. So a lot of officers would never have thought of that idea. And we don't actually know which of these colonels thought of this idea of let's let them retreat. Let's trust them to not go home, but to, once they're safe, reload and then come back up the mountain. And by the way, Morgan did something pretty similar a couple months later, as I said, on January 17, 1781 at Cowpens. He put militiamen in the front, many with rifles, and they fired their one shot. And then he said, it's fine, you can take off. Just don't run through our ranks because you'll confuse things. Go around the side. And that's a little bit misrepresented. It's one of the more accurate things, I'll put it that way, in Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot. It wasn't intended as a surprise that there were other troops there, but they were there. Militiamen were out front with their rifles to soften the British up. And then the British had to deal with the other militiamen as well as the Continental regulars. But anyway, that's a little bit about the strategy. As for the significance of it, Cornwallis decided after Cowpens to not do his main thing, which was, okay, we've conquered South Carolina. Now we're going to move into North Carolina. He fell back to Winnsboro, South Carolina, and then got into the problems that he got into. He lost almost half his army at Cowpens. And that's really, I'm going to use that word I shouldn't use, inevitable again, but it weakened Cornwallis's army so that it never did anything more significant. The next significant thing it did was lose on October 17, 1781 at Yorktown.
When I read military histories, and it isn't often, but it does happen, my experience is that they really cover battles and tactics. So by the time I finish reading one of these books, I know who the participants were, when, where, why, and how they moved across the battlefield. I know about their different fortifications. I know about the artillery and the weapons they used. But these histories fall short of really telling you how these battles impacted people and life on the home front. And this is where I think Liberty is Sweet really shines, Woody, is that in Liberty is Sweet, you really tell us how the war for American independence impacted people on the home front. So would you provide us a bit of an overview of what the war for independence meant for people who experienced this war on the home front?
Yes. Let me bridge the gap from battles to home front by saying how many people who we think of as being figures of the home front were in the battles or very near the battles. And I'm thinking particularly about women. I have a grad student who's writing an amazing thesis about this, which I wish she'd written a little bit earlier so I could have stolen it for my book. But she has, for instance, been pointing out to me how laundresses saved lives. And that is after George Washington in March of 1777 got the army inoculated against smallpox. After smallpox was mostly off the table, you still had to deal with the new men coming in. But after smallpox was mostly off the table, the biggest killer of Continental soldiers, still not British bullets, but typhus. And what's the main way that typhus gets communicated? By fleas. And what's the main way fleas get around, or where do they live? They live in guys' shirts. And so if you've got people boiling water and putting those shirts in the water, that's killing the fleas and saving lives. And so my student's name is Riley Sutherland. She's got an article that I hope will be out soon talking about that and talking about laundresses realizing how powerful they were and going on strike because they knew that they were essential workers to the Continental Army. And I also want to mention how porous the army camps were. None of them had, there were some forts like Fort Washington, although even that turned out to be pretty porous. But most of them had no walls around them, maybe an entrenchment. But my point is women were constantly circulating in and out of the army camps. Maybe they're spending some time with their husbands, but then going to live with mom and dad for a while, or going to check on the kid, or just on a daily basis. Women are constantly coming in to sell eggs and milk products and all that stuff. That's how the Americans took Stony Point in 1779, an enslaved man who had been in the habit of selling stuff to the British. The Americans got them on his side, and he led them in and said to the guards, "Oh yeah, I'm just here to sell eggs." And then his American friends appeared and slit the throats of the guards, and they secretly got very close to Stony Point. So anyway, the camps are really porous. That's also transmitting disease. And you haven't asked about my next project, but I think it's going to be on disease. It's kind of appalling to me that we know so little about how many women died of diseases stirred up by the Revolutionary War. And we really need to know that. In 1775, there was this massive dysentery epidemic. John Bell's written about it a little bit in his amazing Boston 1775 blog. But this dysentery epidemic had killed John Adams' brother, but it also killed his mother-in-law, that is Abigail's mother, and one of their female servants. So if we just take the Adams as our tiny little sample set, yes, this dysentery probably spread by the war. It wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been a war. Yes, this dysentery epidemic kills the guy, Elihu Adams, who's serving with the Continental Army outside Boston. But in the Adams family, 2/3 of the people that it killed were women. And I think based on other little things, you may remember Mary Fish Noyes, the hero of the wonderful book about Joy and Richard Buell, Way of Duty. She nearly died of that same dysentery epidemic. I think, and Doug Winiarski tells me the numbers are there to make some kind of estimate. How many thousands of women, and numbers are there for New England where they wrote down everything your ancestors did. We can calculate how many women died, not just during the war, because people die all the time, but surplus death, excess death because of the war. But talking about the home front, we talked about this a little bit, how women are faced with the challenge of running the farm.
You mean their farm?
Yeah, exactly. What did I say? I hope I didn't say their husbands. I said the farm. I was being neutral, but you're right. It was their farm. I stand corrected. Lucy Knox wrote Henry Knox, who was commander of artillery. She's like, I hope you're going to find out when you get home, quote, there is such thing as equal command. And that is a really significant thing. I think the war had a much bigger impact on women as a war than as a revolution. I mean, you even see it, the Confederacy. Nothing could be more retrograde than that. But, there's a certain number of women who come out, certainly tons of enslaved women during the Civil War and Northern women, but even Confederate women, they're forced to. The famous bread rioters in Richmond in 1863, for instance. And by the way, I have lots of examples of that. My friend Abigail Adams noted in 1777 a coffee riot in which this man who'd been hoarding coffee, waiting for prices to go up because of all the wartime shortages, and a bunch of women attacked him and took his coffee. And she said, we hear they even spanked him. So there was a little hanky-panky going on there. And the way she describes it, these women were just caffeine-aholics. But another person reporting on that same Boston coffee riot of 1777 pointed out that these weren't just women wanting coffee. These were women who wanted coffee to sell because they were merchants and they needed to satisfy their customers, or their customers would go somewhere else. And so that's why they wanted that coffee. And again, something that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for a major crisis like the war.
Woody, now that Liberty is Sweet is out in the world and people are reading it, do you think you've achieved your goals with this book? Do you think that more people are now aware of the hidden history or histories of the American Revolution? Those histories being the many different roles that everyday people performed in the war, in the politics, and keeping the home front alive during the revolution.
The one thing that I'm feeling really good about, so I tweet at Woody Holton USC, although we call ourselves US of C now, but I'm just old school, Woody Holton USC. And I'm hearing from a lot of high school teachers who have gotten a copy of it. And I don't think they're going to be assigning it. I don't think many college teachers are going to sign it. It's 600 pages, but they're reading it themselves. And I think it's going to affect the lesson plans of some of those teachers. And that's the thing I'm most excited about.
And now it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. Now, in Liberty is Sweet, Woody notes that when it came to appointing a commander-in-chief to lead the Continental Army, the Second Continental Congress really only had two viable choices. Artemus Ward, who was the head of the Massachusetts militia and the commander of the New England units after Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, and George Washington of Virginia. Woody, I'm both sorry and not sorry for asking you this controversial question, but in your opinion, what might have happened if Congress had selected Artemus Ward of Massachusetts instead of George Washington of Virginia as the head of the Continental Army in June 1775? How might the American Revolution have been different?
I've been fearing the time warp question, but I love this particular time warp question because I'm going to give you a controversial answer. At least for the next year or so, as you know, Washington took over the Army, the newly created Continental Army, on July 3rd, 1775. And that, at least for that first year, it would have gone better if Artemus Ward had been running it for several reasons. Reason number one, Artemus Ward himself was a New Englander, and that's where most of the troops were from. Not quite all. They just sent a few riflemen up from Western Pennsylvania and Virginia and Maryland. But most of them were New Englanders, and so they knew him. You probably also know, Liz, that Washington really looked down. He sees an officer shaving one of his men because the guy had been a barber. That's what he does. He described even the officers as dirty. I mean, really, it's almost kind of racist language against his fellow white people because they were from New England. And New England and Virginia were just, as they said at the time, different countries. That's what Washington meant when they said country. So A, Ward was of the region. B, one of the first significant decisions Washington made taking over the Army was to kick out every black person. And African Americans had really proved themselves at the battles of Lexington and Concord and at Bunker Hill, where one of them killed the highest ranking officer to die that day. And so forth. But Washington kicked them out. He's I don't hold that against him. He's a white Southerner, slaveholder. You can't imagine having them on his team. And so out they go. He later brought some of them back for various reasons that we could talk about. You probably don't have time, but he did kick them out. But most importantly, Washington's thinking was very British in the sense of, as Charles Lee, who became his second in command, said, the spirit of offense is much greater than the spirit of defense. That is, both Lee, number two, and Washington, number one, thought you could only win a war by going on offense. And he was bent on doing that. Washington kept coming to his Council of War and saying, we got to attack Boston. The officers would say, but it's heavily fortified. They control the water. They're going to shoot at us on the whole way over. And then we got to slog through the mud. We'll be lucky if half the guys even get out of the boat, much less make it up the beach. And Washington, no, we got to go on offense. And he was getting all this pressure from the people that he called chimney corner heroes, like we'd say Monday morning armchair generals or Monday morning quarterback. And so he had all this pressure, attack, attack, attack. And, he wanted to attack across the ice. The generals wouldn't let him do that. But finally, he occupied Dorchester Heights on March 4th, 1776. And what Washington wanted was not what he got. What he got was the British left. And that was a great victory. And everybody was excited, except George Washington, because he hadn't wanted the British to leave. He'd wanted, very complex here, but stick with me. Washington figured, okay, if we occupy Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston, General Howe in Boston will send half of his troops up to recapture Dorchester Heights. So he'll be under strength in Boston, and I can finally do my amphibious assault on Boston. And even Washington admitted, after the British, instead of giving him that opportunity, instead they just left. And so there was no battle. And when he got into Boston and he saw, as he put it, every avenue fortified, almost impregnable, he realized it would have been a disaster had he done what he wanted to do, and Howe had denied him that opportunity by leaving. But it's not like Washington dodged the bullet dodged him, and Artemus Ward never would have done that, because Artemus Ward had been where General Howe had been, and that is at Bunker Hill. And he saw that, with some exceptions, defense always wins. And if you're fortified as the British were, and the enemy comes at you, even if they win, they lose, because they suffer, as the British did at Bunker Hill, 50% casualties. So I'm not going to predict beyond a year, but in that first year, to answer your question, the Continental Army would have done better with Artemus Ward than with George Washington. And please don't give out my email address.
I wouldn't dream of it, Woody. I'm going to let you give out your email address. So where can we get a hold of you if we have more questions or want to talk more about the American Revolution, or perhaps even debate you a bit about your point on Washington?
Yes, if they have anything other than a defense of George Washington, because I do say he changed his mind. He was a dummy at the start. He later realized, as Howe did after Bunker Hill, that the defense tends to win. Howe thought the British, after Bunker Hill, Howe's the hero of Bunker Hill, and he thinks, oh my God, the war's over. We're not going to win. And he was kind of right. They kept fighting, and it was desperate for 6 years. But the Americans, once they figured out not attack. But anyway, email me about anything. I'd love if people want to talk about disease, especially, but anything at all. My email address is holton@sc.edu. That's SC as in South Carolina.
And speaking of disease, you did tease us a bit, Woody, by telling us that your next research project would be about disease during the American Revolution. So could you share just a bit more about what it is you're working on?
Yes. This is inspired by recent research that elevated the number of Americans who died in the Civil War from 670,000 before to 750,000 now. And what that author did was stop trying to add up casualty counts, because, of course, most of the casualties are to disease, not bullets. Instead, he just compared census cohorts, how many guys were alive in 1860 and should have been alive in 1870 and weren't. And you got to break it down by cohort, because, of course, if you're 80 in 1860, you're not supposed to be alive in 1870. So he figured it out, and that's how he got to 750,000, but was quite candid about the fact that that was all guys. So far as we know, 0 women died in the Civil War as a result of the Civil War, either by a stray bullet or much more commonly by disease. So far as I know, and here's where I would love to get an email from somebody if they can find it, but as far as I've been able to tell, there's never been a single estimate for either of those wars of how many women died as a result of the war. That is, by diseases that were stirred up by the war. And of course, it's a very hard thing to do, because women, like men, die of the tropical diseases like yellow fever and malaria, as well as influenza and dysentery and all that other stuff. They die every year anyway. So you'd have to kind of get a normal year, establish a baseline from the 1760s of how many people are dying of those diseases per 1,000 population, and then see what it becomes during the war for both men and women. And then this will be the iffy part that people will question. I think it can only be done in New England, because those Puritan ministers wrote down everything. Doug Winiarski says that a lot of them not only wrote down every single death, but often why people died. And so I think it's possible. I'm busy hawking the first book, and so I haven't really gotten into this, but I'm excited to look it over.
Woody Holton, thank you for rejoining us and for helping us explore and better understand the American Revolution. We had fun on our whirlwind tour of the Revolution, I think.
We didn't get everywhere, but we got to a lot of places, didn't we? So, Liz, I really appreciated hearing so many interesting questions, especially that zinger at the end about Artemus Ward. I appreciated that.
The American Revolution was a multifaceted event that included the participation of a large number of people. As Woody just related, people who we would not normally consider as participants in 18th century politics or military actions actually participated in the American Revolution's politics and military actions. For example, elite women like Mercy Otis Warren, Abigail Adams, and Hannah Griffiths wrote about their ideas when it came to politics. The poetry of Hannah Griffiths of Pennsylvania even encouraged other women, regardless of their social and economic status, to participate in the revolution by joining spinning bees and doing the work necessary to ensure economic protests, such as the non-importation, non-exportation movements, were successful. Women also kept the war efforts going as they cooked, cleaned, and provided nursing and laundry skills to both the British and American armies. Now, although laundry may not seem as an essential task to keeping an army in fighting condition, Woody mentioned new research that actually shows that it was, in fact, a vital task to keeping the armies healthy enough to fight. African Americans also did their part to help both armies win the war. Freeing enslaved African Americans joined military companies in New England and elsewhere, and fought at important battles like Bunker Hill. They also questioned and pointed out the hypocrisy of the revolutionaries' principles of freedom and equality, while at the same time they enslaved hundreds of thousands of people. So many African Americans also voted with their feet. Thousands of enslaved African Americans took Lord Dunmore and Sir Henry Clinton up on their offers of freedom by running away from their enslavers and self-emancipating, which in turn greatly hampered the work of military supply and economic trade. Now, for their part, Native Americans joined all sides of the military conflict and remained neutral. They based their decisions on what they saw as the best course of action for their economic and political needs. Now, although Woody did not say this explicitly in our conversation, the hidden history of the American Revolution is that everyday people from all walks of life participated in the American Revolution. The revolution wasn't just a movement precipitated and led by elite white men. It was led and made possible mostly by everyday people, men and women, from all walks of life and from many different cultural, racial, and ethnic backgrounds. You'll find more information about Woody, his book, Liberty is Sweet, plus notes and links for all the books and historians Woody mentioned in our conversation on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/325. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. If you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. This episode of Ben Franklin's World is supported by an American Rescue Plan grant to the Omohundro Institute from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Jessica Brabble, Martha Howard, and Holly White. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other events of the American Revolution do you think we should explore on this podcast? There are so many events and avenues that we could explore and highlight, so let me know what you think. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation.